Welcome to another episode of VNture Podcast, your weekly source of visual novel goodness. I am Amar, and together with Tauros, we shall venture into another discussion about VNs. Today we have a tough topic on our hands, not least of which is the name. So let me try it. Bowdlerization in VNs. Oh, I hope that's correct, and with this big boy word, we got a help from the amazing fun translator. PabloC, welcome back.
Hello everyone, and thank you for the invitation. Let me introduce myself again because I haven't been seen here in a while. I am Pablo, and I dabbed a little in fan translation. I'm also an enthusiast of visual novels and reading them in the original language lately. Because on top of just translating things, I mainly learn Japanese just to enjoy the medium in the original form, which is quite related to today's topic, actually.
Oh, yes. Thank you so much, Pablo, and we're very glad to have you and your opinions and insight about some of these topics. So, let's get started. First off, I'll explain the title of our episode for anyone not familiar with the term. Oh God, I hope I say this right too, because this is a pain in the butt. Bowdlerization. Okay. It's named specifically after a man, Thomas Bowdler, back in the 1700s, who was a translator for important works back then for the Bible and, Shakespeare, and as well as other works. However, he would make some creative edits to the translations. And specifically, now we have the term Bowdlerization for any translation efforts to alter a topic to make it less rude or offensive. There can be various reasons, maybe the fear of lawsuits, or maybe just wanting to be more political correct, or maybe the publishing company has their own doctrines. But the important part is that it markedly decreases the product's quality. I don't mean just some things that might be flavor decisions or the creative approaches. I mean, these are things where the product is actually being more misunderstood, or some jokes just straight up do not make any sense, or they are now introducing plot holes into a work. There's been a few, examples I'm sure you all can think of in visual novels. I think the easiest example would be If My Heart Had Wings, if any of you guys are familiar with that.
Yes, I remember that title rings a bell, I would say.
How one route, is pretty... It centers around the main character and another heroine being, friends with benefits. And the official English translation taking a very bizarre approach to kind of remove the entire context and just cut out any, sexual connotations. And so you end up with some route where everything is butchered and the events make no sense and the relationships are whack.
Basically, the entire plot is about progressing from the friends with benefits relationship into a proper boyfriend and girlfriend relationship. But when you cut out the friends with benefits from the entire story, there is nothing to progress to. So it basically lost the entire meaning. And on top of that, the translation quality was not that great. And when you add things up, it turned out to be a completely messy, unreadable stuff that basically didn't make any sense whatsoever.
Exactly.
Not that the rest was any better, actually, but at least it made some sense in English. Although the translation was not that great as well, and everything was butchered beyond recognition, like changing the anything that related to boobs into eyes, which led to some hilarious moments. And the screen showed a close-up on the heroine breasts, and the text said something about her eyes.
It's how she had such huge eyes.
Oh my god.
That was that.
Exactly. In that case, everyone can see this context makes no sense. And then on the flip side, there's also another term that you'll see in translation discussion called Woolseyisms, named after Ted Woolsey, who was the primary translator for Squaresoft back in the 90s, a hugely influential and popular video game company specialized in role-playing games and strong story narratives. And they are a Japanese company, and as such, this would be released in Japanese. And Woolsey was known for frequently modifying the scripts for, creative reasons or for technical limitations of the devices at the time. And that can be its own heated discussion. The term of a Woolseyism is usually meant positively of any changes in translation that enhance the quality of the work. Probably the most famous example is Final Fantasy VI. You had the main villain Kefka, who was a pretty lame villain over in Japan, and mostly because of Woolsey's edits and changes, became one of the most iconic Final Fantasy villains over on the English side of things by giving him so much more personality. It's hard to get in discussions about that with visual novels, not only because you need to have the experience to see the changes, but because there's always differences in opinions of how the translation effort should be handled. Because obviously, you do want the same emotions and the same story and the same content to be brought over in English preferably, but you don't want to make it into something completely different like a Ghost Stories anime dub,
Yes, exactly, because although the dubbed version of this anime is quite popular, and it is quite hilarious in its own right, it completely changes the original, and I watched the original with subtitles as well. It was quite an interesting story about the Japanese folklore, so it had some value. It was mediocre at best, but it was fine to watch. Whereas the abridged version, basically, which is the dubbed version, it's a hilarious, very politically incorrect comedy made by rather talented people, I would say. And the jokes there are really hitting hard, so it's also a really fun thing to watch, but it's something completely different. So personally, I'm not a fan of any changes like that, even if they turn out to be good, because I want to experience when I'm taking something from Japan. Is it an anime, manga, visual novel, video game? Doesn't matter. I'm interested in experiencing the original as closely as possible, because I was interested in the original to begin with. I don't want to experience someone's fanfiction. If I want that, I go read some doujinshi or something like that. So I choose intentionally to do that. I don't want fanfiction in the work that is supposed to represent something else. So I'm not a big fan. Of course, Bowdlerization is out of the question, but changes for the better, I'm also not a big fan of those.
That's crazy, because both listening in for your response and example of Final Fantasy that Taurus brought before, my instinct was, that doesn't matter. Exactly like you said. So what if it makes it better or more iconic? What if, just to extrapolate the point, what if that made me learn Japanese, in order to read it in its original language, and now I'm disappointed? Because ultimately, I didn't get what I wanted. I got an author's interpretation of the work, or translator in this case. Wow, yeah. My initial thought, even changes for quote unquote the better, I don't want. I want this thing that is inherently from the Japanese folklore, culture, whatever, translated as closely as possible. That is reasonable to do. Probably we'll get into some very hard to translate examples later, but still, as closely as possible, preserving that thing I wanted to double in, instead of whatever amalgamation that would be with the Bowdlerization or Woolseyisms that you brought up. I cannot agree more, Pablo. I cannot.
Also, there is this thing that Woolseyisms are actually quite rare, because it takes a lot of talent to write something that is better than the original author that created the entire world, the entire characterization, the entire setting, usually. So the author of the original work is deeply inside this entire scenery, and it's really difficult to be an outsider who didn't create this entire reality, basically, and actually create something that will beat the original. So it can happen, it can be quite good, but I wouldn't bet on it. So usually changes a lot for the better.
Well, the easiest example against that is George Lucas with the whole Star Wars series. If not only is there his vision of some of the more kind of bad Star Wars movies that have been since taken over by other people with their vision for the Star Wars series, and they've created spin-offs, sequels, even, I want to say off the top of my head, his wife was an editor and was a huge part in making the very first Star Wars movie the success it was. So on the one hand, I do have a lot of respect for creators and the works they provide. I don't think they're always the wisest person in the room when it comes to their works, though.
Oh, and I think on that note, I think I need to acknowledge, exactly like PabloC said, when it comes to Woollyisms, for it to work well, I suppose you need not only to match, but also surpass the original. So I'll give them credit. Okay. Yeah, I acknowledge that has to be tremendous effort and talent. I still don't like it. I still probably prefer the original as close as possible. But you are right, Taurus, that you could correct some crucial mistakes the original author might have made in whatever fashion there can be it editing or Woollyisms. But yeah, I still I just want the original author's vision, okay? Then I can correctly judge is it good or bad.
A good example here would be a prose that Howard Phillips Lovecraft writes. He's not exactly a great author in terms of writing. He has great ideas, he has great concepts, and he was very innovative for his time. However, his writing, when I tried it in the original in English, it's not that great. I'm not a big fan of his style of writing. I like his ideas, but style not so much. So I found it actually quite a bit more enjoyable to read a translated version, the translation in Polish, which was quite faithful, but it was written a little better. It missed the original, original poorly written sentences. However, I still prefer to actually read the original works almost all the time. Even if they are not that greatly written, I still feel like I'm missing a little bit, even when the translation is well done. So yeah, that's why I learned Japanese to begin with, and that's why I almost never read translated works if I can get my hands on the original version, if it's in a language I actually understand. So yeah, I can acknowledge that there can be some improvements in the process of translation, localization, and such modifications, but again, these are very uncommon. It takes two things. Basically, the original author needs to do something not so great, needs to do some mistakes. Then someone who translates or releases the work needs to be competent enough to actually improve them. And only when those two things come together, we can get something that actually is an improvement. And yeah, that's very uncommon. That's a very uncommon situation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Pablo, you've mentioned you're a fan translator, and so obviously you've had to tackle some of these questions when you translate the titles you've reviewed, right?
Yes, exactly. Not so much in Wailing Guignol, because that was a pretty straightforward story without much nuance. However, in Konosora, or If My Heart Had Wings, there was plenty of humor. There were jokes, there were references to Japanese pop culture like Tuchan and so on. So there was a lot to tackle there, and that's why I ended up producing a massive translation notes The PDF file had, I don't know, more than 10 pages, I think. And I tried to include everything that I had. I wasn't exactly certain if I did a good job of translating, or things that I actually had to intentionally modify because they were impossible to translate into English directly. So I tried to tackle all of those problems in that way. It's not optimal. I would say the good translation should not use any translation notes at all, but it's not always possible. And that's my idea of a compromise. So yeah, there were plenty of things that I had no idea how to convey in English very well, while staying close to the original. So I needed to make some modifications, and although they were always in the intention of conveying the same meaning as the Japanese original, because that was basically my intention.
A question on that topic of the translator notes. I'm a person who, when starting a VN or even any game, I read the manual immediately, all through to the end. I know manuals aren't that common nowadays. I know.
That's so sad.
But how do you recommend, or in that case of Konosura, how did you develop the translator notes? Is this something that is a supplementary during the reading, or something to read before the reading, or is that something to read after completion?
I made a few sections and I titled them differently. Since this visual novel was released on Steam, and I expected some people who are not exactly in the anime community to actually read that, I made a section for newbies, basically, where I explained all the honorifics, all the things that were left over from the original language in translation, like sensei and stuff like that, to make sure that everyone who isn't familiar with the basic weeb stuff, basically, can actually read those before tackling the visual novel and get proper understanding of everything that was left from the Japanese language. Then I made some explanation about the culture, like when is the summer vacation, when is the winter vacation, when the semester starts in Japan, because it's different. It starts in winter in Japan, not like in most countries in summer. They have longer winter vacation, and that's when the semesters switch. Naming order and stuff like this. So basics for people who are just coming from Steam, from normal video games, and never had much contact with anime. The second section was a huge section about food, because I found while I was translating things, I had to look up a lot of things about food, because I'm not familiar with Japanese cuisine at all. And while I was doing it, I was quite interested by some of the foods that were mentioned. So I just included what I found with photos, just to make it a bit more colorful in terms of translation notes. That was something that just basically caught my interest personally. It's probably useless for 95% of the audience. If someone wants to check what kind of food are they discussing, he can check the translation notes, and there will be a basic explanation with photos. It's the section that can be read at any moment, basically. And finally, there is a section with the troublesome translations that I had to either improvise a bit, modify slightly, or that requires some longer explanation because they may not be perfectly clear in English. That's the section that probably is best saved at the end of the reading, after you are done with the specific route, for example, or the entire visual novel, just to check what could be missed in the translation. So that was my idea behind the translation notes, and that's how I organized them.
Thank you. And one of the first VNs I ever read was Tsukihime, and I was a complete newbie to the whole weeb Japanese culture sort of stuff. That translation patch came with a Word doc notes about honorifics and common ones and what they meant. That was a lifesaver to me. So yes, I can tell you now, from the me of, 10 years ago when I first started getting into VNs, thank you so much for including that, Pablo.
Yes, actually, that's exactly how I learned about honorifics, because one of the visual novels I was reading, I don't know which one, maybe Fate Stay Night, it was one of the early titles that I tackled, also had a file with translation notes and basic stuff properly explained. So yeah, that's exactly my story as well.
I did want to ask you a question of whether you include or remove honorifics in your English translations and how strongly you feel about those.
In almost all cases, I try to preserve them because they are understood by everyone from the weeb community, basically. And they can be easily explained with translation notes. And it's really difficult to translate the nuance of honorifics because honorifics can change. People can drop honorifics when they are referring to each other. They can use honorifics in unusual way, like referring a man with a Chan honorific, which has a lot of potential meanings, either demeaning, insulting, or maybe endearing. But it's hard to properly translate them into English, so I prefer just leaving them intact. It's easier, it's more accurate, and usually doesn't cause much problems. There are very few cases where I would omit honorifics. If they are not really used to convey any nuance, they are just there in the story because that's how the language works, and they don't really fit the story. So the setting is not in Japan, the setting is somewhere in America or in some European country or in some complete science fiction setting. That's where I could think about omitting honorifics, but it's usually not worth the effort because everyone can understand them anyway, and well, you don't really gain anything by omitting them other than English purity. It's important, but I'm not too crazy about it, so I just prefer to leave them as is. Although the best solution would be to prepare two different versions, one with honorifics and one without, if possible. That would be an optimal solution, though it's usually, again, not worth the effort, and I try to do this with Wailing Guignol translation, because the Steam allows multiple different translations to be included in the release, but yeah, the publisher said that it would be too much effort to just put it in, so we just picked the version with honorifics and call it a day.
Because I remember a few of the titles that do feature a honorific toggle in settings. I'm like always impressed. Like, yeah, that's such a simple solution to the divisive topic, and obviously, you can make both sides happy at that point. Just make a toggle.
Yes,
I
would
like
say
honorifics.
I would say it's not that simple because engines of Japanese visual novels sometimes are completely messed up, and adding such a toggle can basically make everything explode. So yeah, it's not always that easy, but I would say that's the optimal solution.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, it is conceptually easy, not necessarily with implementation, but if you were to approach it with the toggle in mind on the process of translating or debugging the engine, if you approach it with that in mind from the get-go, I think you can make it happen. I saw few examples that did, so they prove it's possible. And I specifically tried saving, switching, nothing explodes. So it's not like bound to save or anything like that.
Yeah, if it's possible technically, it's of course a good solution. Although for something like Konosora, for example, or If My Heart Had Wings, I actually don't know how to get rid of honorifics because important part of one of the roads, I think it was about Kotori, was changing how the characters refer to each other and how they drop or change honorifics. And messing with that, I don't have a good solution for translating such a situation. You would have to basically do some localization stuff and alter things intentionally just for the whole story to make sense. So not always, but a situation where dropping honorifics would be possible without losing much to the story.
And just to make sure, I wanted to note on the manual front, please make more of them. Because my start with anime stuff wasn't with VNs, it was with the anime. And I was so lost with honorifics for the longest time. Even after I got the basics down of the hierarchies and how that works and how important age of characters is in relation to each other, and why oftentimes a lot of exchanges with Japanese people in anime starts with how old are you? Because they establish who is older and how to apply honorifics on that basis. Until that point, I was super lost. After learning the basic, I was somewhat lost because on extension of what you said, so mismatching honorifics can mean different things, and it took me, forever to understand one title that specifically referred to a male protagonist by antagonist with Chan, and I didn't know what the hell. Do you not know how to use them? And after a long time, I understood. Okay, so he was purposely infantilizing him. Okay, I see. Okay. Yeah, please make more manuals, please.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and that's where making intentional alterations or localizations can actually make some sense. When your target audience is made of people who are not really into the in-anime community, like you are releasing a visual novel on Steam, where you will mostly get gamers, not necessarily anime fans, some level of localization can make sense. Also, if it's a video game or a story meant for younger audience, you can't really expect, 12 years old kids to know the details about Japanese honorifics and such. So yes, something like Phoenix Wright, which is a heavily localized video game, it actually makes sense, and I'm not going to criticize it too much, because they did a good job at localizing things, and this is again something meant for rather a bit younger audience. So even though they went really far with localization, changing the names of characters, changing the location to California, and losing a lot of sense in the context, that sense would have been lost on the audience, which is, again, it was marketed for much younger audience that is actually required to understand the nuances of Japanese justice system, which the original Gyakuten Saiban actually refers to. So again, this is a compromise, but there is some use for intentional alterations to the story. They can be useful, but only in the limited scenarios.
Yes. Speaking of Phoenix Wright and how, yes, it's suited for a different audience, I also wanted to talk about a few other specific VNs related to this episode. Really, the only one I can think of off the top of my head as an example of a Bowdlerization would probably have to go to Cyanotype Daydream. If you missed the whole drama that went down with it about a year ago for the English translation, the short answer is that one major change was made to take a college age and a college setting instead of the original high school setting. And overall,
which included, yes.
Exactly. Overall, it wasn't handled very well because there are many glaring inconsistencies in the script where it still reflects the original high school setting, such as having a homeroom, such as one scene taking place in a crowded lunchroom for the lunch bell. These are elements of a high school, and they don't translate to being a college setting, even though the story and the script is trying to say it is. The stated reasons for why the company did this are, honestly, I don't want to go too far out on a limb, but obviously a reason is probably to get away from the original 18+ roots and to make it a more clean version. And so, it's one of those cases where there are forces outside of the translator's control, where maybe companies are making some decisions that they have to follow. And overall, it just leads to an inferior product, especially when the script itself isn't lining up with what's supposed to be going on. It creates inconsistencies, and it takes away from the visual novel story and the experience.
Exactly, and this is not really something that can be justified because if it's made for Steam specifically, yes, that makes sense because Steam is very inconsistent. It's specifically targeting anything with anime aesthetics, and if there is anyone in the high school uniform, this thing will be banned, basically, even if there is a risk of that at least, especially if it's somewhat related to something 18 plus, even if it's not available on Steam. So yes, censoring, going ham with censorship for the Steam release, we can understand that. But this doesn't justify not releasing a proper version of the title. There is good old games
On different platforms,
yes,
not on Steam.
different platforms, on Just USA store. Kagura Games now releases some visual novels as well. So there are places where you can completely safely release an 80 plus title. Uncensored Sayano Uta is on Good Old Games with not so adult looking main heroine. So there is no excuse for that. Gore Screaming Show is on Good Old Games with a lot of really questionable things happening there. Again, with not so old looking main heroine. So again, there is absolutely no excuse for releasing only the heavily butchered version. So I don't have a problem with heavy-handed censorship for the sake of Steam. It's understandable because Steam is not a platform for any Japanese content, I would say. It's very hostile towards this type of content. So I can understand making this type of censorship. However, again, the original version should be available somewhere. There is a huge demand for that because restoration patches are being created. So it's not a demand of the audience to actually use censorship. Censorship doesn't benefit audience in any way. It doesn't benefit the author. It just limits what the author can actually create. So it's universally bad, and there is absolutely no excuse for it.
Well, I do want to say first off that there's two kinds of censorship. One is the part where it's designed to protect people who don't have the maturity or the experience to know what they're getting themselves into. Like, for example, a 10-year-old kid can't walk into a rated R movie. Even if they say they want to, and even if they think they'll be fine, it's like, no, buddy, you need to wait till you're an adult. And then the other kind of censorship is when the companies or third party or whatever decides, if they don't like it, then no one else should. And it can come apart to, for example, the Steam review process where they just ban certain visual novels because they don't like it or because it affects their bottom line or whatnot. And those are the types that are exclusively to just benefit themselves and not the customers. I definitely agree with you that the second type that you're talking about in a case like this is, it's very frustrating as a fan when you want to try to support something and the business and the companies have other ideas in mind. It makes for a very frustrating experience.
Yeah, it's like they actively do not want my money.
Yeah, and I want to push back a little bit on the type first, what you said, Taurus, because in my opinion, age-gate barely qualifies as a censorship. I think it's a kind of different process altogether. But I know where you're coming from, because you basically say in order to adhere to legal precedents that adult things shouldn't be experienced by non-adults, you define that as a censorship. No, I block access for you because you can handle the material. Yeah, I agree. And I just want to note how crazy it is that the very first time they announced the Steam accept visual novels, it was crazy. Probably the biggest success story to this day has to be Evenical one. And at that time and place, GOG was super adamant against anything 18 plus and barely accepted visual novels. And whenever they did, in forums, in discussions, number one topic was always restoration patch on GOG. Mm-hmm. Now, trying to push something to Steam is a hard endeavor in it of itself, and GOG is like, yeah, we accept you. Oh, come here. Mm-hmm. Like, what happened? This is... Oh.
Yeah, this is crazy how this entire thing have turned.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Also, coming back to the first example of censorship, I wouldn't really qualify age gating as censorship, because censorship fundamentally means a destruction of certain content, on making the certain content not available at all in a certain area, certain language. Yes, so I would qualify censorship as a purely destructive, obstructive action. Whereas age gating is something that doesn't really restrict the presence of a certain content, just limits who is this content available for, which actually is sensible. Just like content warnings, for example, because being 18 plus, it doesn't mean that you actually want to see stuff that's going on in Gore Screaming Show, to just name an example off the top of my head. So yeah, content warnings, as long as they don't go too far and include some spoilers, for example, because trigger warnings are an entire different category. But yes, warning about an obviously questionable content that may not be for the majority of the audience, actually, pointing out that this content is just for the niche audience and you have been warned, basically. Yeah, this is, again, not exactly censorship, because content itself is still fine, it's still included. It's just noted that it's potentially questionable, and do you really want to get into this thing? And that's perfectly fine.
I completely agree.
The problem is that
before you take over, Taurus, please, because I think one example, obviously, turning off Gore in Gore Screaming Show would be weird, but it didn't. Euphoria had a toggle. Can you remember that, Pablo? I think they had. I think
that Gore Screaming Show also had a toggle like that. Yes, I'm pretty sure it had. Or maybe just increased the censorship, because I only read the original version, and Gore in that was also censored. I mean, pixelated. And I think there was a toggle that made it darker or something like that. So yeah, there was something like that, I think, even in Gore Screaming Show. But yeah, Euphoria, I think, also had something like this, that it blurred images or made them darker.
Yeah, for certain material, yeah. Well, I mean, I consider that more in line of preferences rather than censorship, whereas you're just giving the reader more options, exactly like honorifics. You know, I think it would be very silly to say that enabling or removing honorifics is an example of censorship.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Yeah, but we likened it less to censorship itself, but rather more to the access limitation, which was spawned from your type 1 definition of censorship, right? That was the whole point.
No, yeah, exactly. I agree with you about that.
Yeah.
No. But I still believe that, no, for the type 1 that I mentioned, the movie, for example, you mentioned content warnings of saying, hey, this stuff coming up is 18 plus or whatever. Those are usually done so the companies can cover their butts, so they're not at fault if someone bypasses the warning and sees stuff they don't like, and they can complain, oh, well, you didn't warn me for this. Well, it's like, yes, we did. You can't sue us. Whereas when you have something like the movie, like I said, the movie theater demanding to see ID, or, you know, certain payment companies only accepting you if you're requiring ID that shows you're over 21 to buy certain products online or whatnot. Again, those are from government mandates and laws. That's kind of by definition an outside agency imposing the restrictions on it for the material you are allowed or not allowed to see.
Yes, restrictions are one thing, but removing or banning certain type of content is entirely different. So restrictions are fine as long as something is still accessible. I have no problem with that. It's actually quite reasonable, and it's usually useful. So most of the restrictions, as long as they are sensible, they usually actually aren't a big problem, and they actually help, because of course children should not be exposed to any explicit sexual content or extreme violence. Actually, I think violence is a little bit more mainstream than it should be. I think it should be more restricted. We should have
that's
radical. Yes, we have very radical in the West, at least. We have very radical restrictions on sexual content. Violence, it's fine. In Japan, it's the opposite. Violence is actually quite heavily restricted, whereas edgy, light sexual content, it's really fine even for younger audiences. I think both should be restricted quite heavily, actually, but that's just my opinion. But again, that's not an excuse for actually completely butchering something and removing content from an existing product. So that's a completely different story.
I do want to talk about another title while we're here about the whole translation and Bowdlerization material. And one that's also caused up some stir of recent drama would be Nukatashi. Specifically, the translation efforts. And on the one hand, there are many lines interjected with all sorts of, political humor, cringe Zoomer jokes, and all sorts that have been making the rounds. And specifically, though, I wanted to talk to you, Pablo, about some of the material in Nukatashi that is very challenging to create an identical, translation for, or is, what are your thoughts about some of the lines that we, discussed beforehand?
Yes, from what I have seen about the translation, it seems to be a mixed bag. It's a meme game to begin with. It's full of jokes, and it's basically they are using made-up terms. They are using terms that are misread intentionally. They are written in a different way than normally. They are using different characters. So it's a massive mess for translation. I had some difficulties with jokes in Konosora, in If My Heart Had Wings, but this thing is on a completely different level. So I can see why the translators would have to actually be forced to make some very creative decisions. I don't think it's possible to just translate something like this one-to-one and give it an accurate translation, because accurate translation will probably not really convey what the original meant to convey. So you lose the original meaning by being super accurate. On the other hand, I saw a lot of political references. They are strictly American references that I don't quite get because I'm not an American. I know English, but I'm not familiar with American culture, with strictly American memes, American politics, and these things in the translation completely fly over my head. I have no idea what they're talking about. Now, I would have a much higher chance of actually understanding very niche Japanese memes, because, well, I am reading visual novels, so I'm naturally quite interested in Japanese culture. So I probably have an easier time understanding the original jokes and original memes, even if they are somewhat obscure, than some American cultural references when I'm not really interested in American culture. So that's a big problem I have with those kinds of Americanizations, not even localizations, but pure Americanizations. I'm not American, and I don't get them at all. Half of the time I just have to look them up on the internet to find out that this is just some kind of weird, specifically American situation. And of course, there are probably some less than competent translations. It happens. Again, I'm not a big fan of inaccurate translations, and the translators should try to make the translation as accurate as possible. They tackled, I think, a very difficult title, and it's not difficult as in Muramasa or DS Era, where you at least feel that you are translating something ambitious. I think translating something like that would be rewarding. This is just a funny mess. I can see why some translator could look at this and say, I'm translating this nonsense, let's just write something, whatever it is, and call it a day. So yeah, that's a problem. And I don't think I will ever read this thing in English. I don't think, even with the restoration patch, as far as I know, they still have problems with translation quality, because that would probably require something like Konosora, basically a total retranslation, to actually be accurate. And I'm not sure if it would be actually better, because a lot of things would be lost in the accurate translation, and you would probably end up writing an entire book of translation notes if you really wanted to be accurate and preserve the meaning. So yeah, it's a difficult, actually a very difficult thing to translate. I'm not surprised that they messed it up. This doesn't change the fact that they did mess things up.
Well, okay, that's a lot to cover. I want to say one thing though about references is that I know some people have, that's been a regular complaint from some people I've met, how many translations tend to be American-centered references. As much as I now am aware of Japanese culture and general references and goings-ons and whatnot, there's still a lot I don't know about Japanese references. So to be honest, I don't really mind where they come from, because you're either going to catch them or you don't, and some people treat it as a learning opportunity, and some others are just like, okay, well, how was I supposed to know that? And there's no real equivalent. Like, there's one old joke VN called OMG WTF OTL. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of that.
Oh yeah, I'm familiar with that.
It is off the wall crazy and nonsensical and violent. But I mean, at one point, there's the appearance of a character, Master Gotch, and he was a very influential pro wrestler in Japan. And even if you're, as engrossed in Japanese, the otaku culture and whatnot, it's like, what are the odds that you're going to know who he is? Like, I'm a pro wrestling fan, so I happen to know, not at the time, but I do now, but it's like, even then, if you take that reference and if you're translating this work, do you leave it as that? Obviously, you can't really kind of say Hulk Hogan instead, because his sprite comes up in the picture, so they have the visual aid. But still, it's one of those things where, like, you have references, and no matter what, some of them are going to go over your head. So that's kind of a mess in itself.
Yeah, that's tough.
I have one question, though. And maybe it's an open question even to translators. Why do you fear that people will not get it?
Well,
Why not?
Because that's getting it is quite literally the point of translating things. So I need to write something that the audience will understand. So I assume that my translation, since I'm either dealing with niche visual novels or even more niche doujin eroge, they are for the hardcore weebs, basically. So I can leave honorifics because I assume people will understand them. I can leave sensei, something like that, because again, I know that the audience will probably understand that. And just in case, I always leave translation notes and explain everything for an unexpected guest from Steam, for example, who just tackles the game without knowing anything about the culture. But the whole point of translation is to make something that will be understood by the audience. And it's always a balance between being faithful to the original material and writing something that will be actually readable by the target audience. So if you just write something full of niche Japanese memes and jokes that don't translate at all when actually written in English, kanji puns that basically are lost in translation completely, idioms that only exist in Japanese, well, you end up with a mess that's no better than some kind of machine translation, because that's what machine translators actually do. They literally take the text and just output an English word for word or an English sentence with some aid of some AI, but they don't really think what the original line was meant to convey. And that's the role of a human translator, to actually look at the original line, look what it actually means for a Japanese person, and try to write something that will mean exactly the same thing for the American person or some other English speaker. So that's the whole point of translation. And you sometimes have to sacrifice the original content if it's a reference for some very niche anime. I think I did omit one of those in Konosora, I made sure to write about it in translation notes for the purists who want to know exactly what was in the original. That's my solution for such problems. But again, optimal translation shouldn't really rely on translation notes, and I try to limit them to things that are impossible to write in a way that an English speaker would understand. So I have to do some creative omissions there. But again, I try to limit those as much as possible, because I assume, again, that my audience is a bunch of weeps who know exactly what the basics of Japanese culture are, and they shouldn't have a problem with that. But again, it depends on the audience that you are targeting your translation.
Interesting. Maybe I'm willing to accept that I don't get a reference just because I like to research those references. So I don't mind. Okay, put it another way. Pablo, I don't mind if you pose me a challenge to understand the concept. I don't mind that. And you say, as a good translator, you try to provide it as clear as possible within means, obviously.
Yes, I try to limit challenges to a minimum, because, well, that's not really the point of translation. The translation is supposed to give you the original work in a similar way that the Japanese person actually receives it. So, of course, it's impossible to do this perfectly, and I'm nowhere near good enough to actually consider myself capable of doing that. But at least I'm trying. That's all I can do at this point. However, yes, the understandability of the end result is necessary for the translation to be good. That's why actually translations have good editors who are fluent in English and who are good English writers to actually convert what is written as a raw translation and write something that also not only conveys the original meaning, but also reads well in English, which is something I sometimes struggle with. For example, I struggled with medical English because that's what I use every day. And I ended up writing things that were probably very difficult to understand to someone who is not a medical professional or medical student, because I was using professional language unknowingly. That's where our editor helped me a lot by converting what I wrote to something that is understood by a general public. Yeah, that's also a thing that's important. You need to think about the audience. And I like challenges myself. I like to research references, and that's something that I enjoy. But I cannot force my personal preferences on the general audience. And I am aware that general audience probably doesn't want to look for stuff on the internet, do some research, find out some title of some obscure anime, just to understand a simple joke in a visual novel.
That is true. I'm here reading the visual novel. I don't want to go down a rabbit hole.
Well, that's the best part.
I mean, if I wanted to go down a rabbit hole, I'd just hit up random articles on TV tropes or Wikipedia.
Oh, no, don't do TV tropes. You would never leave that site.
Oh, God, I know, right? But I would be doing that instead of reading the VN I have open in front of me, you know?
Exactly. And even though I like to do research, yes, if you are not translating for yourself, although I largely do, because I did this as a mean to basically exercise two languages at the same time, and that was my main motivation. But yeah, if I am releasing something, at least, because I can do something on just for myself and keep it on my PC. But if I am releasing something, I have to make it basically useful for other people. I don't have to think about just myself, because I learned Japanese for a reason. I'm never satisfied with translations, and I like to do research to the point that I actually read in the original language. So I am quite extreme on this end. But again, I'm probably not my own target audience when it comes to translations, because I don't read translations at this point.
That's true.
So,
my God. Huh. Fair point.
I like how you mentioned that there's the English writing side to a translation as well. Because on the one hand...
Could be, at least, because more often than not, it's just a basic translation, just simple check for typos, and that's it. I don't see... It's rare to see, at least in the fan translation community, it's rare to find a good editor who would then go over everything and fix stuff. Just like we had in the Konosora project, a pilot who looked over everything that was related to aviation and fixed stuff so that it actually made sense in English, and it was professional and actually reflected what is actually going on in aviation. So that's a rare opportunity that we had, and it's very uncommon to actually see something like that.
Because there's the Japanese side where you're trying to figure out the meaning of what it's trying to say, the context and the emotion involved. Half of it is understanding that from the Japanese, and the other half is, I guess you could say, properly conveying it in English. Like you said, with proper English terminology and watching out for any typos and keeping the story flowing together in a sensible manner. Because it's a lot of times when I see people complain about bad translations, it's just they pull up screenshots of like typos or, incorrect grammar. And part of me is like, okay, well, yeah, that's one side of it, although that reflects more of a poor editing job, to be honest. There's also, I guess, what people usually consider with translation is conveying those meanings from Japanese to English. And I like how you mentioned how, there's the two sides. There's the part you do that you focus on, and then also the need for the editing team to cover the other half.
Yes, and there are two things that can basically go wrong. You can get the original meaning wrong, and then write a very correct, very nicely edited English sentence that actually doesn't reflect what is in the original. And that's the primary sin of edited machine translations. So
exactly.
You can take the input that is more often than not quite inaccurate. Then you edit it so that it flows well in English. It seems like a logical English sentence, but then it gets the subject wrong. It gets the object wrong of the sentence. It's missing the subtle context. It doesn't get the reference, doesn't get an idiom, and so on and so forth. So you can get a nicely looking output that looks like a proper translation. However, it's nonsense. And that's where censorship also comes into play, because, again, something can be intentionally altered to mean something that was different in the original. Because original, for example, said that someone is underage, but you don't want this in your translation, so you replace it with someone that looks very nice in this dress, for example. Something that's intentionally conveying a different meaning than the original. And again, if you're just an English reader and you don't know Japanese, and the work doesn't even have voices, for example, well, you are just stuck with the translation, and you may have no idea that this cyanotype daydream is set in high school. You just see something that doesn't really add up, something that doesn't look like college, something that seems off, but that's what you have, and you don't have anything to compare it to. So this is something that can be a bad translation, whereas you don't really see that in the English version.
Definitely. I think, though, we'll have to start wrapping this episode up. We have gone for quite a long while, more so than we anticipated at first, but thankfully, you had so much to offer and so much to discuss with us, and I think I speak for MR as well, saying that we had a blast.
Oh yeah, we definitely had a blast, and just a slight info from the backdoor of how the preparation went. I died so many times hearing all the horror stories from translations. I'm still shocked now, and we're ending the episode. I'm still shocked hearing what you guys said, okay?
I'm a little jealous that MR managed to be a VN fan for so long and not hear any of the drama that's been going on.
Yeah, it was
I want to
quite
be like
hard
you.
to miss, I would say.
First and foremost, I don't follow VNDB. And secondly, whenever I see something, I just tune that out. I'm not interested in the title. Goodbye. I have a stress-free life. Thank you very much.
I'm not exactly stressed myself because I know Japanese, so I have no worries about poor translations.
True.
Although I would actually like to support them, and Yeah, but they just don't want my money. That's yeah.
Yeah.
Aye. Well, thank you everyone for listening. I hope you very much enjoyed the episode, and we look forward to seeing you all next week.
Thank you for the
Exactly.
invitation. I had a blast talking about all of this stuff as well, and see you maybe later.
See you next week. And a quick shout out to Kyle Rayner Mason for suggesting today's topic. Bye.
Goodbye.